I reckon folks think owning a ranch means peace, quiet, and a good stretch of land between you and your neighbor's nonsense. That was true for a long time out here in Dry Creek County. My land's been in the family since my granddaddy rode cattle down from Montana in '42. I kept it going after my father passed cattle, a small vineyard, and a private spring that runs ice cold year-round, straight from the mountains. It ain't much, but it's mine, or at least, I thought it was until the HOA decided to dig a pipeline through my north pasture without so much as a knock on the door. The whole mess started the way most bad things do, quiet, slow, and with a Karen dot. Now, I ain't one to go accusing folks lightly, but if there ever was a textbook example of a suburban tyrant, it was Karen Del. She wore power like perfume, strong, overbearing, and it lingered long after she left a room. She ran the Dry Creek Ridge HOA like a monarch, even though that new development was barely 10 years old, full of city folk trying to play cowboy, gated community, artificial lawns, matching mailboxes right up against the edge of my land. We never had trouble before the new folks came in. My ranch backs up to the back end of the subdivision, a mile of cedar fencing and open grassland between us. I didn't even know there was an HOA till the letters started coming. At first, it was silly stuff, complaints about livestock odor, unauthorized structures, a barn built in 1979, and even a request to remove my windmill as it obstructs the view. I tossed them all. I figured they'd get bored once they realized I wasn't part of their jurisdiction, but Karen doesn't get bored. Karen gets vindictive. It wasn't until I found the PVC markers and survey tape scattered across my pasture that I knew they were up to something real. I was out feeding the horses one morning when I saw the red flags staked right through the middle of my alfalfa field. My first thought was county road work, but the county clerk had no record of anything. A day later, I caught two men in Harditz, stomping around with a GPS reader and plans in hand. One of them, some pencil-neck named Tad, claimed to be working on a water distribution enhancement project. For who? I asked, leaning on my fence. The Dry Creek Ridge HOA. He said without blinking, this pipe will increase water pressure for the entire community. I blinked slower than a sun-baked turtle. You do know you're standing on my land? Well, he fumbled, glancing at his tablet. Our permits indicate an easement for utilities was approved by the development board. That's so, I drawled. You got that in writing? He didn't, just waved around a screen like it was scripture. Turns out, the HOA had filed for an emergency supply easement during a drought season last year, and someone at the county offices had rubber-stamped it by mistake. They assumed my ranch was part of the HOA's extended properties, which it ain't, and never has been. But Karen, she saw that clerical error as a golden ticket. A week later, construction equipment started showing up. Bulldozers, trenchers, pipes, and a smug little sign. Dry Creek Ridge Water Project, enhancing community wellness. I raised hell at the county meeting, waved deeds, maps, water rights hell. Even a signed statement from the late Judge McMurtry, who'd notarized my spring rights back in 1986. Didn't matter. The board regretted the misunderstanding, but said reversing the pipeline would be costly, and advised me to work with the HOA to reach an understanding. The only understanding I had was that Karen thought she could take what wasn't hers and dress it up as progress. So I tried the polite route. Sat down with Karen and her vice president, some guy named Brent, who wore boat shoes, to a ranch meeting. I explained the spring was on my land, that the pipeline was an illegal intrusion, and that I expected them to pull it up and leave. Karen gave me that tight-lipped smile, the kind you only see in beauty pageants and restraining order hearings. Mr. Harper, she said, voice dripping with fake sugar, this water source will benefit over 200 families. We assumed you'd be honored to contribute. Funny, I said. I always thought charity was voluntary. You're being obstructionist, she snapped. If you refuse to cooperate, we may be forced to involve legal counsel. Brent leaned in. You don't want to go down that road. I leaned back, real slow. Ma'am, the only road I'm going down is the one off my land. I suggest you join me. She didn't. Instead, she doubled down. Within days, the pipeline was fully installed. They tunneled a trench across my north pasture, right over the underground spring that feeds into the HOA's new storage tank. I watched them from my porch, arms crossed, as if daring me to interfere. I didn't. Not yet. See, I'm old, not dumb. And revenge. Revenge tastes better when it's cold as the spring they'd just stolen. That's when I made a phone call to a man named Russell Cobb. He's a property investor up in Aspen. Slick, but honest. We'd done some horse breeding deals back in the day, and I knew he'd once tried buying a chunk of land up near Mount Eldonland, where my spring starts. It's remote, rugged, and not worth much unless you happen to know what lies beneath. It took some doing, but within a month, I'd secured ownership of the entire ridge where the spring had originated. That's right. The HOA's precious water supply didn't just run through my pasture, it started up in those hills. And now, I owned every square inch of it. I gave him a weak dot, no response. Then I turned the valve. You ever hear 200 lawns go brown overnight? It sounds like victory. At first, they thought it was a break. Karen sent out a cheerful newsletter. Minor disruption. Water service to resume soon. But when the HOA's hired plumbers climbed the ridge and found a newly installed iron gate with a big OL private property, no trespassing sign bolted to a pine tree, panic started to spread. I didn't hide. I knew they'd come. And sure enough, 3 black SUVs showed up at my gate 2 days later. Out stepped Karen, Brent, and a man in a cheap suit who introduced himself as their legal consultant. We need access to the water source, Karen said, trying to keep her cool. It's on private land, I replied, sipping sweet tea from a mason jar. And this time, the deed's solid. You're jeopardizing the well-being of families, she hissed. No, I said. You jeopardized them when you laid pipe without permission. The lawyer tried to argue public necessity and implied easements, but I handed him a copy of the Supreme Court case that said otherwise. You got 2 options, I told them. Rip out the pipe, or start paying. I got a rate sheet if you're interested. Karen turned redder than a fire hydrant in August. This is extortion. No ma'am, I said with a smile. This is business. Welcome to the free market. And that's when she made the worst mistake of all. She called the sheriff. I was trimming the grapevines along my southern fence line when I saw the dust cloud rising from the road like a snake slithering. Across the valley, 3 black and white cruisers, lights flashing but no sirens, rolled up the gravel drive like they owned the place. Karen followed in her white Lexus, perched behind the wheel like she was about to receive a trophy instead of a reality. Check. Out stepped Sheriff Dean Mallory. Now, Dean and I go way back. Grew up 2 towns over. We weren't close, but we'd played baseball in the same dusty summer league. He's a fair man, but too polite for his own good and too tied up in re-election to want drama with HOA voters. I wiped the sweat from my brow and walked up with my hands in my pockets, keeping my voice calm. Dean, I said, to what do I owe the visit? He gave me a tight nod. Afternoon, Tom. Got a report of tampering with utility infrastructure. I looked over his shoulder at Karen, standing there like she was the Queen of England, about to reclaim lost colonies. Tampering, I chuckled. I didn't tamper with anything. I own the infrastructure they're talking about. Karen stepped in, armed with a manila folder and her usual nuclear smugness. Sheriff, this man has unlawfully shut off water to over 200 residents. We're filing for an emergency injunction. We have elderly people, children. This is a humanitarian issue now. Dean turned to me. Is there any truth to that, Tom? I pulled a copy of the property deed from the folder I'd prepped just for this occasion. I own the ridge, the spring, the flow rights, and the cutoff valve. It's all here, clear as a glass of mountain water. What I don't see in their paperwork, I said, jerking a thumb at Karen, is a legal easement or water purchase agreement. They dug a pipeline across my land based on a bad assumption and never corrected it when I told M. Dean took the papers and read them slower than molasses on a cold day. This is solid, he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. You filed all this through the county, stamped and sealed last month. I even brought cookies to the clerk's office. Karen hissed through her teeth. You can't just cut off water. This is criminal behavior. No, ma'am, I said coolly. What was criminal was trespassing on private land and drilling through my pasture without consent. You want water, you'll pay for it, or you'll dig your own well. The sheriff turned to Karen, clearly tired already. Look, ma'am, it's a civil dispute. If you want access, you'll need to take it up in court. Until then, I can't force him to turn the water back on. Karen's face puckered like she'd bitten into a lemon. Fine, she snapped. Then we will take this to court. And when we win, I'll make sure your entire ranch is condemned as a safety hazard. I grinned. Then you better pray for rain, sweetheart. She stormed off in a cloud of indignation, high heels clicking over gravel like a tap dancer with a vendetta. 3 days later, I got the summons. Dry Creek Ridge HOA versus Thomas Harper claim, interference with utility services, public nuisance, and economic damages totaling $1.6 million. Now, I may be a simple rancher, but I ain't stupid. I called up my nephew Caleb, who practices landlord down in Austin. Smart kid, always wanted to be a cowboy, ended up wearing a tie instead. He drove up that weekend with 2 suitcases and a grin. They're in over their heads, Uncle Tom, he said, thumbing through the HOA's filing. Their claim relies on a false easement. The water rights documentation you have from 1986 is ironclad, but here's the kicker. He pulled out a copy of the original subdivision agreement filed by the Dry Creek Ridge developers. Turns out, their water plan never included sourcing from your spring. The board at the time planned to drill a municipal well, but Karen convinced them it'd be cheaper to reroute from existing supply lines, so they amended the plan illegally without a new environmental review. And the county let it slide, I asked. Karen's got friends in low places, Caleb said, but none of that will hold up in court. The case dragged for 6 weeks. In the meantime, HOA lawns turned brown, gardens wilted. The neighborhood Facebook page was a war zone. Karen kept posting cheery updates. Temporary shortage. Thank you for your patience. Meanwhile, residents were hauling in water jugs from Costco and screaming at each other over hoses. And then came the twist. One morning, Brent, the vice president in boat shoes, showed up at my gate with a sheepish look. Mr. Harper, he said, trying to sound casual, the board has authorized me to discuss terms. Oh, I said, arms crossed. Karen send you. He scratched the back of his neck. Not exactly. She's been voted out. Emergency meeting last night. Things got a little heated when her plan came to light. I chuckled. You all finally read the fine print. Something like that. He handed me a fresh contract. The HOA was offering to buy water at triple market rate. They'd also pay for restoration of my pasture, plus damages for the illegal trenching. In exchange, I'd agree to restore limited flow to their tanks. I took the contract, looked it over slowly, then handed it back. No deal, I said. Brent blinked. But why? That's more than fair. I don't want their money, I said. I want my land left alone. They can haul water in barrels for all I care. He sighed. So, what would it take? I paused, staring out across the ranch toward the hills. The sun was setting, casting gold across the ridge. My daddy once told me, a man's land is like his handshake, firm, unbending, and honest. That's how I saw it too. I want the pipeline gone, I said. Every inch. I want a written apology from the board to the county, admitting what they did. And I want your HOA bylaws rewritten so no one ever pulls a stunt like this again. Brent looked like he'd swallowed a cactus. That's a lot. I met his eyes. So was stealing water. He didn't answer right away, just nodded, slowly. I'll take it to the board. 2 days later, I got the call. They agreed to everything. That night, as I stood by the edge of the spring, listening to the rush of cold water beneath the earth, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not because I'd won, not because Karen lost, but because my land was mine again, or so I thought. Because just as I was packing up my tools that evening, I got a call from Caleb. You might want to sit down, he said. I braced myself. The HOA, they weren't just piping in water. I froze. What do you mean? They were planning to bottle it, sell it as premium Spring Ranch Reserve water through a shell company Karen set up 2 years ago. I was speechless. They've got a warehouse lease, a full website under development, even a pending deal with a health food chain in California. My jaw clenched. Karen didn't just want the water for the community. She wanted to build a business off my spring, off my land, and that changed everything. I sat there on my porch that night, Caleb's words echoing in my ears. They were going to bottle it. Your spring. Karen had a whole operation lined up. I looked out at the pasture, wind tugging at the grass. That hid the pipeline they'd buried without my say so. Beyond the cedar fence was the HOA's matching loan neighborhood, a manufactured paradise with zero respect for the land that fed it. It wasn't about water for lawns anymore. It wasn't even about trespassing. Karen Delacourt had built a business empire using my land, my water, and my silence. But I wasn't quiet anymore. By dawn, I had a plan. First thing I did was meet with a local investigative reporter, Marlene Shaw. She ran a small-town paper that nobody under 50 read, but the older crowd trusted her like gospel. I showed her everything: deed records, the cut-off valve, Caleb's evidence of the bottling scheme, and the warehouse lease. The name of the shell company was DCR Naturals LLC, Dry Creek Ridge. It was all there in black and white. Let me guess, Marlene said, raising an eyebrow. Karen's name isn't on a single document. Nope, I replied, but her husband's is. So is Brent's. Oh Lord, she muttered. This is gonna blow up bigger than the July 4th parade scandal. The headline ran 2 days later: HOA leaders secretly bottling stolen spring water for profit. Local rancher fights back. The effect was immediate. Karen tried to downplay the article, calling it reckless journalism and baseless rumor. But the rest of them senior citizens who'd spent weeks without water weren't buying it, especially when Marlene released a follow-up piece showing contracts with real signatures, HOA meeting minutes with secret votes, and emails where Karen referred to the spring as their liquid gold jackpot. The board scrambled to distance themselves. Brent resigned. 2 other members issued public apologies and claimed they had no idea what Karen was doing. Meanwhile, HOA members held their own emergency vote, and this time, Karen was officially removed from the HOA entirely. But that wasn't enough for me. Not yet. See, the warehouse lease was under a subsidiary tied to Karen's husband's construction company, and according to county records, they'd already begun installing bottling equipment funded by HOA dues, HOA money, from families, from retirees living on fixed incomes. I could have sued. Caleb said we had enough to bury them in court filings for years, but I had something better. I drove down to that warehouse myself, pulled up next to a delivery truck labeled DCR Naturals, and waited. When a worker came out back for a smoke, I struck up a conversation. Nice setup, I said, tipping my hat. Yeah, he muttered, though it's weird whole thing's been paused. Something about a lawsuit. I handed him a letter. Mind slipping this to your boss? He glanced at the envelope. What is it? A cease and desist, backed by water rights law and one very angry rancher. He chuckled. Ain't my business, man. Nope, I said, but it's about to be theirs. That letter shut them down, but I wasn't done. With Caleb's help and a little help from Marlene's new spotlight, we petitioned the county to have the entire pipeline deemed an illegal utility installation on private land. The Board of Supervisors reviewed the case, held a special session, and voted unanimously. The HOA had 30 days to remove the pipeline or face daily fines of $2,500. Karen tried one last Hail Mary, filing a countersuit claiming eminent domain, but she had no authority to do that, and the judge laughed her right out of the hearing. And then Justice, the sheriff, the same Dean Mallory who'd come out to investigate weeks earlier, personally oversaw the HOA's construction team as they dug up every inch of that pipeline, section by section, from my land. I watched from my porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Boots kicked up on the rail. At one point, Karen tried to come over and speak. I met her at the gate. She wore her usual pastel blouse and expensive sunglasses, but the cracks were showing: red eyes, frizzed hair, voice quivering under the weight of her fall. I just wanted to say, she started, I never meant for this to go so far. No, I said calmly, you meant for it to go further. You just didn't think anyone would stop you. You've made a lot of enemies, she said, trying to recover her usual edge. I smiled. Good. That means I did something right. She left without another word. The final nail came a week later. A group of HOA residents, some of whom had been Karen's biggest supporters, showed up at my ranch gate with homemade pies, thank you cards, and a letter of gratitude signed by 173 homeowners. We didn't know what she was doing. One older gentleman said, "You saved our community from being turned into her piggy bank." Just looking out for my land, I said, and making sure no one else gets run over in the process. One woman, maybe in her late 70s, leaned over the fence and said something that stuck with me. You made her drink from her own poisoned well. By late fall, the pasture was fully restored. The trenches were gone. The scars of the pipe healed over with new grass, and the quiet rush of my spring beneath it all. I still own that ridge. Still walk up there every Sunday morning just to listen to the water, the birds, and the wind. Sometimes I see the Dry Creek Ridge neighborhood off in the distance, lawns growing again, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving to each other with a new sense of calm. They've since rewritten their HOA bylaws. No more secret projects, no more unapproved spending, and certainly no more Karens in charge. Marlene wrote a follow-up piece called The Rancher Who Turned Off the Tap, and it made its way all over the state. Caleb got a few dozen calls from folks asking for help with their HOAs. He's thinking about opening a new practice just for that. As for me, well, I'm just back to ranching. Fence posts, grapevines, horses, peace. But I keep the letter from the HOA, the one where they offered to buy my water framed in my barn. It reminds me that no matter how big they think they are, no matter how deep their pockets or sweet their words, land still means something, and so does the man who defends it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around. I've got more wild HOA tales coming your way.